I am Conrad, 72 years old, and somehow still processing the night my own son tried to erase me from his life. As a retired logistics founder, I spent my life building an empire only to hide my wealth to teach my son the value of hard work. That lesson failed miserably. Last night at exactly 1:00 in the morning, my phone lit up with a text from my son Garrett. It read, "We need distance from you. Please stop contacting us." When I moved into the hallway, Sienna, my daughter-in-law, was already positioned beside my packed bags, a smirk on her face. "Garrett doesn't want any back and forth," she told me. "Get an Uber." I gave a quiet nod, set my polished steel keys to the house on the walnut entryway console, and stepped out into the freezing rain. But once I was settled in the back of that cab, I fired off a single reply. "Of course I will cancel my direct deposits first. One more thing. Do you know who really owns the mansion? That hour 1:00 in the morning used to be the one part of the day I actually treasured, the only time the vast suburban mansion stopped performing and felt, however faintly, like somewhere a person actually lived. I'd been flat on my back in the small East Wing bedroom, eyes fixed on the ceiling, while the slow, muffled chime of the antique wall clock hanging at the end of the hall mixed with the soft drumming of freezing rain on the glass. Every joint in my body ached a quiet tax on 72 years of living a good stretch, of which I'd spent hauling heavy crates long before a desk had my name on it. Then the nightstand blazed white, my phone sudden and harsh in the dark. I grabbed it, eyes narrowing against the brightness. The name on the screen was Garrett's. I read the message once, then again, letting the meaning settle. "We need distance from you. Welcome back to Grandpa's Revenge. I'm glad you found your way here today. Before we get into the story, drop a quick comment for me. I'd love to know, is this your first time sitting down with one of these stories? Or have you been along for the ride for a while? Either way, you're welcome here. Now, a word before we begin: some details in this story have been shaped for the purposes of dramatic storytelling, and any resemblance to real people or events is entirely coincidental. What matters is the truth at the heart of it. Your presence is disrupting our lifestyle. Please stop contacting us. I read those words 3 times over. There had been no argument leading up to this, no explosive dinner, no raised voices. Just this, a cold clinical dismissal pushed through a screen by a man who was sleeping a few doors down the same hallway. I pushed the heavy duvet off slowly and brought my legs over the side of the bed. My bare feet found the hardwood floor. What I felt in that moment wasn't rage. It was a deep, hollow weight dropping into my chest like a stone. I pulled on my robe, my mind demanding I go find him and get an answer, face to face. You don't push your father out the door with a text message. I walked out of my room and down the long, poorly lit corridor. The only sound was the slow, muffled chime of the antique wall clock hanging at the end of the hall, a beautiful, ornate piece. It had been Cecilia's favorite. That sound sent a sharp, sudden ache rising into my throat. When my wife died 10 years ago, a vast emptiness opened inside me, and I made the ruinous mistake of trying to fill it by giving Garrett everything he ever wanted. I told myself I was comforting a son in grief. What I understand now is that I was simply feeding the roots of his entitlement. The clock's chime seemed to mock my folly as I reached the main foyer. I had every intention of heading straight up the stairs to Garrett's master suite. But my path was cut off. There beneath the crystal chandelier stood my daughter-in-law Sienna, fully dressed in her satin loungewear, arms folded tight across her chest. At her feet sat my 2 battered canvas duffel bags, already zipped, already packed, already dumped carelessly on the floor. Sienna didn't look the least bit startled to see me standing there. If anything, the corners of her mouth curved into a thin, self-satisfied smirk. Before I could even frame a question, she casually lifted her foot and nudged one of the heavy bags in my direction. "Garrett doesn't want any back and forth," she said, her voice carrying the flat indifference of someone disposing of old furniture. "Leave your keys on the console. Get an Uber." I stood there, taking in the woman my son had chosen. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't beg. I didn't ask her where exactly she expected me to go in the dead of a winter night. I had simply dropped my gaze to the cold imported marble under my feet. I paid for every inch of that stone. Every vein running through it was purchased with decades of sweat and sacrifice as I dragged my company up from a single delivery truck. But Sienna's sneer pulled a very specific memory to the surface. The day she married Garrett, she had made an absolute scene over the wedding budget, insisting on a $60,000 ceremony to impress her social circle. I had quietly written the check, handing it over without argument, naively thinking it was a one-time gesture to set them up well. I could see clearly now that my generosity had never registered as a gift. It had been read as weakness. I reached into my robe pocket and took out the polished steel keys to the house. I crossed to the walnut entryway console and set them down. The metallic click rang out sharply through the silent, cavernous foyer. I didn't spare Sienna another glance. I gripped the handles of my bags, pushed open the heavy front door, and walked out into the biting cold. The freezing rain found my face immediately soaking through my robe and cutting straight to the bone. I didn't look back. 10 minutes later, I was in the back of a damp, poorly heated taxi, giving the driver the address of a highway motel at the edge of town. The smell of pine car freshener filled the cab. I drew my phone from my pocket. The screen threw pale light across my wet, lined face. I opened the messaging app and brought up Garrett's text, the one ordering me out of their lives. My thumbs hung over the keyboard. I didn't write a paragraph of sorrow. I didn't demand explanations. I typed a handful of short, deliberate sentences. Of course, I will cancel my direct deposits first. One more thing. Do you know who really owns the mansion? I hit send. I watched the small status icon beneath the message. Within seconds, the word red appeared. The taxi tires hissed over the wet asphalt as we moved through the dark city. I turned toward the window. Beyond the rain-streaked glass, we rolled past the vast industrial park on the west side of town, the very ground where I had constructed my logistics empire. 40 years of work turning one rusted delivery van into a regional powerhouse. When I finally sold, I walked away with $15 million. But I never shared that figure with Garrett. I buried the wealth deep inside a blind trust, convinced that keeping him ignorant of the real numbers would push him to develop his own drive, an old man's dream. The truth was that concealing my success had only made him feel owed the crumbs he assumed were all there was. I glanced back at my phone. The screen had come alive. 3 gray dots pulsed rapidly at the bottom of the chat window. Garrett was typing. Then the dots stopped. Then they started again faster than before. I could picture him bolt upright in his expensive bed, the color leaving his face as my message dismantled the comfortable fiction he'd been living in. He was panicking. I didn't wait around for his excuses or his frantic backpedaling. I pressed my thumb to the power button on the side of the phone and held it down until the screen went black, swallowing the back of the taxi in darkness. The rain kept hammering the roof of the car as I rested my head against the cold glass. The quiet reckoning had officially begun. Pale fractured lights pushed through the cheap plastic blinds of the highway motel as dawn arrived, slicing thin, broken lines across the stained carpet. The neon vacancy sign outside my window buzzed with a low mechanical hum, blinking its faded red glow into the frozen morning. I sat on the edge of a mattress that offered me nothing, breathing in the mingled odor of old cigarette smoke and cheap industrial cleaner. I am 72 years old, a man who built a regional logistics empire from nothing, a man whose net worth sits comfortably in the 8 figures. And yet, there I was, shivering in a $40 roadside room on the city's outskirts, turned out into the winter rain by my own blood. I hadn't slept a single minute. My mind was too clear, too locked onto the hard facts of what had happened only hours before. The initial shock of standing in that marble foyer, staring at my packed bags and my daughter-in-law's smug expression, all of that had burned away completely. What remained in its place was a cold, absolute clarity. For years, grief had been my blindfold. When Cecilia died, I lost the one person who kept me grounded. I tried to fill the crushing silence of that enormous house by giving our son Garrett whatever he asked for, hoping his contentment might somehow become my own. I believed I was being a devoted father. Sitting in that dim motel room, I finally told myself the truth. I hadn't been a father to Garrett in a very long time. I had been an ATM. I got to my feet joints cracking in the cold, and moved to the small scratch laminate desk wedged into the corner. I unzipped my briefcase and lifted out my laptop. The hinge creaked as the lid opened, and the screen cast pale light across my tired face. I connected to the motel's unsecured internet and opened my secure browser. My fingers rested over the keyboard for a moment before I entered the address for my primary wealth management portal. The login required several rounds of authentication. I typed each password with a steady, unhurried hand. The dashboard loaded liquid assets, checking accounts, various credit lines arrayed across the screen. I bypassed the main investment portfolios and went straight to the joint operationals account, the one I had foolishly tied to Garrett's life. The transaction history filled the screen, a long descending column of figures that told the entire sorry story of my son's existence. I let the data settle over me. Thousands of dollars at high-end steakhouses, charges for imported wine luxury car lease payments, and steep monthly dues for a country club Garrett barely set foot in. Every line was proof of a fraudulent life. He was performing the role of a self-made man, a titan of industry entirely on my dime. I scrolled to the recurring transfers section. There it was. An automated outbound transfer set to go out on the 1st of every month. $12,000. The memo field beside it read, Project Support. I kept staring at those two words. Project Support. 5 years back, Garrett had walked into my study, clutching a glossy, half-baked business plan. He told me he was launching a revolutionary tech startup, an app that was going to upend the delivery industry. He spoke with real passion, a kind of desperate urgency, swearing this was his chance to step out from under my shadow and carve out something of his own. He needed seed money, he said. He needed a monthly operating budget to pay developers and hold down server space. I could see the business plan was full of holes. Any investor worth their salt would have binned it on the spot. But I looked at my son's eager face and thought of Cecilia's dying wish that I be patient with him, and I said yes. There was no tech startup. There were no developers. The project never got off the ground. That $12,000 a month quietly transformed from a business fund into a personal slush fund, bankrolling Sienna's designer wardrobe and Garrett's image. Month after month, year after year, the money dissolved into the bottomless pit of their vanity. Part of me had always known it, but I had chosen to look the other way. I was terrified that pulling the money would mean cutting the last thread connecting me to my family, but last night they cut that thread themselves. They threw me out like unwanted trash, convinced that living in my house and spending my money gave them the upper hand. They had completely forgotten whose name was on the trust. I moved the cursor across the screen to the recurring transfer. That small digital arrow sat directly over the button marked Cancel. My hand was steady. My breathing didn't waver. I felt the crushing weight of the past decade beginning to lift. This wasn't merely a financial transaction. It was an execution. I was dropping the blade on the fiction my family had become. Clicking that button meant dismantling the entire foundation Garrett had built his life upon. I pressed down on the trackpad. A small confirmation window appeared, asking whether I was absolutely sure I wanted to permanently delete this recurring payment. I clicked Confirm. The screen refreshed. The $12,000 transfer disappeared from the dashboard. Gone. The safety net was officially cut. I eased back into the cheap plastic chair and listened to the rain tapping against the motel window, feeling a deep, icy sense of release. The bleeding had stopped. The parasite had been removed. I took a slow breath of the stale room air, preparing to move on to the insurance policies and the auto loans ready to methodically reduce their financial world to ash. But before I could navigate to the next tab, a sharp chime pierced the laptop speakers. A red alert banner dropped down from the upper right corner of the banking portal. It was an emergency fraud notification on my secondary platinum card, the card I had handed Garrett 5 years ago, strictly for medical emergencies. I clicked the alert eyes narrowing as the transaction details filled the screen. 2 separate charges had just been attempted, $4,000 each, $8,000 total at a downtown Italian designer boutique. The timestamp showed the transaction was being attempted right now at this very moment. I stared at the screen, a cold, dark fury tightening around my chest. It was 7 in the morning. Sienna had put a 72-year-old man out in the freezing rain at 1 Holzrum in the morning, and the first thing she did when daylight came was go online and try to charge $8,000 worth of designer clothing to his account. They didn't just want distance from me. They wanted to drain me dry while I was still standing. I leaned toward the screen, its glow reflected in my eyes, and clicked into the security controls for the platinum card. The game had just shifted. I watched those pending transactions pulse on the laptop screen like a warning beacon. $8,000 at a downtown Italian designer boutique swiped mere moments after my own son and his wife had shoved me out into the freezing rain. My hand hovered over the trackpad, trembling slightly, not from the chill of the damp motel room, but from a deep, nauseating recognition of what I was looking at. I remembered the exact afternoon I had handed Garrett that secondary card. 5 years ago, not long after he'd complained about a sudden health scare and the steep out-of-pocket costs his inadequate insurance wouldn't touch. I had sat him down in my study, the leather chair creaking as I leaned forward to place the card in his hand. I looked him straight in the eye and told him this was for medical situations or genuine emergencies only. I wanted him to have a real safety net something, so that he would never have to face a true crisis without backup. Now, staring at that bright screen in this miserable room, I could see plainly that the only crisis my son and his wife were navigating was a shortfall in their luxury wardrobes. They were toasting my eviction with a morning shopping trip. I went into the card controls. With one click, I selected the option to report unauthorized use and permanently freeze the account. A prompt asked me to confirm. I clicked yes. The system updated at once, throwing a bright red banner across the account, details showing the card was now locked tight. Somewhere downtown, standing at a gleaming glass counter, Sienna was about to slide that platinum card across to a cashier. Within seconds, she was going to meet the very first consequence of her arrogance. The thought brought no satisfaction, only a heavy necessary resolve. The bleeding had to be stopped, and I was the only one who could do it. But the credit card was just the opening move. If I was going to cut these cords, I needed to sever them completely, leaving no loose threads for them to grab hold of. I picked up my cell phone, unlocked the screen, and dialed the 24-hour customer service line for my premium auto insurance carrier. An automated system walked me through the prompts until a live representative came on. A polite young man named Aaron asked how he could help me this morning. I steadied my voice and kept it firm. I need to remove 2 vehicles from my master policy. Immediately, I told him. I read off the license plate numbers from memory, the sleek imported luxury SUVs that Garrett and Sienna drove around town. Vehicles I had foolishly co-signed and folded into my corporate umbrella policy to shield them from financial liability and keep their monthly premiums virtually non-existent. Aaron paused. The clicking of his keyboard echoed over the telephone line. "Sir, if I remove these vehicles, they will be entirely uninsured from this moment forward. Operating them on public roads without valid coverage is a serious legal matter. Are you absolutely certain you want to proceed with this cancellation?" I didn't hesitate for an instant. "I am completely certain," I replied. "Those vehicles are no longer my responsibility." I listened as he processed the request, the finality of it settling over me like a heavy cloak. Those cars were Garrett's ultimate status symbols, the gleaming armor he wore to project the illusion of a self-made man to his country club circle. By noon, taking either one out of the driveway would be a significant legal and financial gamble. One traffic stop, one minor fender bender, and the whole illusion would come apart. I thanked Aaron for his time and ended the call. I turned back to the laptop. The motel room was still cold, the undersized wall heater rattling feebly in the corner, but I barely registered it anymore. I was working with a clinical, detached precision I hadn't drawn on since the days I was hammering out cutthroat freight contracts. I logged into the cellular provider portal and suspended the unlimited data plans on their mobile phones, setting the termination to kick in at the end of the billing cycle in 3 days. I went to the country club management website and submitted a formal withdrawal of Garrett's sponsored family membership. Every comfort, every convenience they enjoyed traced back to my name, my unblemished credit history, and the labor of my lifetime. I cut them away one by one, click by click, account by account. For decades, I had carried the weight of their lives on my back, convinced that if I let go, Garrett would fall and never find his footing again. I had talked myself into believing my unending financial support was a replacement for the mother he had lost far too soon, a way to hold our fractured family together. But looking now at the canceled accounts and the frozen assets spread across that screen, the ugly truth was impossible to deny. My support had not saved my son. It had thoroughly destroyed him. It had turned him into a hollow man who could look his 72-year-old father in the face and discard him into the winter night without a moment's hesitation. I wasn't tearing his life apart this morning. I was simply compelling him to live within the means he had actually built for himself. I eased back in the cheap plastic chair and pressed my palms against my tired, burning eyes. The process was nearly complete. The financial fortress they had been so comfortable inside was now effectively reduced to rubble. They just hadn't figured that out yet. I reached for the lukewarm cup of terrible motel coffee I'd pulled from the lobby machine an hour earlier. Just as I brought it to my lips, a sharp, distinct chime cut through the silence of the room. Not a standard text notification, a high-priority email alert. I set the foam cup down on the scratched laminate desk and leaned toward the screen. The sender was the private security firm, contracted to watch over the sprawling estate I had just been thrown out of. I clicked the subject line, my pulse ticking upward. The message was an automated alert. Someone was actively attempting to override the master alarm codes from the main control panel inside the mansion foyer. I shut the laptop, that security chime still ringing in my mind. Garrett wasn't content with driving me out into the winter rain. He was now trying to lock me out of my own property by changing the master alarm codes at the mansion. I didn't panic. I simply packed my computer into my worn leather briefcase, pulled on my damp overcoat, and stepped out of that freezing motel room. I drove my rental through the relentless morning downpour toward a small, greasy spoon diner on the industrial edge of the commercial district. The kind of place with scuffed vinyl booths, the sharp smell of scorched coffee, and absolutely no risk of crossing paths with anyone from my son's fabricated high society world. I settled into a quiet corner booth, ordered a plain black coffee, and waited for my reinforcements. 20 minutes later, Harlan Voss came through the fog glass doors. A sharp 52-year-old attorney who perpetually looked as though he'd just stepped out of a high-stakes courtroom. He shook the rain from his charcoal overcoat, spotted me in the corner, and dropped into the booth across from me. I didn't offer a warm greeting or waste time on small talk. I unzipped my briefcase, pulled out the laptop, turned the screen to face him, and slid it across the sticky laminate table. Harlan adjusted his glasses and studied the display. I had left the evidence open for him. First, he read the text from Garrett, the one demanding distance and ordering my removal at 1:00 in the morning. Next, he examined the banking portal, noting the canceled monthly outbound transfer of $12,000. Then his eyes moved to the security alert for the $8,000 in attempted designer purchases on the frozen platinum card. Finally, he read the estate security firm's notification, showing someone aggressively trying to breach the alarm panel in the main foyer. Harlan worked through the digital wreckage in complete silence. No gasp. No hollow expressions of sympathy or shock. He's a man built for legal warfare, and he simply read the battlefield laid out in front of him. He pushed the laptop back across the table and folded his hands. "They think you're a helpless old man living under their roof," Harlan said, his voice a low, steady rumble that carried over the background noise of the diner. "They forgot whose name is actually on the trust." I looked down at my dark coffee, feeling the full weight of those words. Harlan had managed my financial trust for 15 years. He knew every hidden asset, every property line, every offshored account I held. More than that, he was the only person who had ever had the nerve to look me in the eye and tell me the uncomfortable truth about my own son. Years ago, shortly after Cecilia passed away, I had sat in Harlan's office to establish the blind trust. I wanted to keep the bulk of my $15 million logistics fortune out of Garrett's reach, give him a modest cushion while making him build his own drive. Harlan had warned me even then. He told me that propping up Garrett's lifestyle, even in support, would rob him of any chance to develop real character. He said that handing a young man unearned luxury would cause his sense of entitlement to eventually turn poisonous. I had argued with him hard that day, told him I was simply protecting a grieving boy. I looked up at Harlan now, sitting in this worn-down diner, the bitter weight of my own foolishness pressing against my chest. "You were right," I said quietly, the exhaustion of the past decade in every syllable. "You were right about him all along. I had watered a weed and stood there waiting for an oak tree to grow." Harlan didn't gloat. He simply nodded and took a slow sip of the terrible diner coffee the waitress had just poured. "You gave him everything," Conrad Harlan said firmly. "A mansion he didn't buy, cars, he didn't earn a social standing he could never have funded on his own. It's no surprise he eventually talked himself into believing he was the master of the estate. But delusions don't hold up in a courtroom. The mansion belongs entirely to the Cecilia Merritt Trust. You are the sole trustee. Garrett is nothing more than a non-paying guest who has dramatically overstayed his welcome." I asked Harlan where we stood legally regarding the house and the remaining assets. He explained that with no formal lease in place, Garrett and Sienna were legally considered tenants at will. We could begin formal eviction proceedings the very next morning and lock down every remaining peripheral asset tied to my name. I leaned across the table and told him I wanted all of it done immediately. I wanted the trust tightened until it was airtight. I wanted every financial bridge scorched so thoroughly there wouldn't be a trace of ash left for them to find. I wanted them to feel the exact same biting cold of the reality they had handed me. As Harlan began running through the specific legal documents we'd need to file before the end of the business day, his cell phone buzzed against the laminate table. He glanced at the screen. A slight frown crossed his otherwise composed face. He picked up the phone, raised a single finger, asking for quiet, and listened. I watched his expression travel from professional curiosity to a hard, calculating stare as he absorbed whatever was coming through the line. Harlan ended the call and set the phone down slowly. He looked at me, and the air in that corner booth suddenly felt dense and dangerous. "My firm automatically monitors any legal inquiries involving the name of your estate," he said, his voice dropping a full register. "We set those alerts up years ago as a basic security measure." I nodded, my pulse rising, waiting for him to go on. Harlan leaned in, his eyes fixed on mine with sharp urgency. "That was my senior paralegal," he said. "Your son just reached out to the office of a well-known family law attorney downtown, a man who makes his living pursuing aggressive, hostile conservatorships." A cold chill moved through me that had nothing to do with the rain hammering the window. I asked Harlan exactly what Garrett was inquiring about. "Garrett is asking about the expedited legal process for having a senior citizen declared mentally incompetent." Harlan replied, the words landing like a physical blow. "He is trying to have you certified as suffering from severe dementia so he can seize emergency power of attorney over all your assets." The air inside the diner seemed to thicken after Harlan delivered the news about my son's conservatorship inquiry. The waitress swung by and refilled our cups, but I left mine untouched until the coffee went cold. I stared out through the rain-streaked glass at the gray morning beyond, working through the sheer clinical cruelty of what Garrett was reaching for. He didn't just want my money. He wanted to strip away my autonomy entirely, have me locked away in some facility, my basic rights dissolved, so he could go on performing the role of a wealthy socialite without interruption. I brought my focus back to Harlan. He had already opened his briefcase and drawn out a sleek silver tablet, his fingers moving quickly across the screen. He didn't need me to give the order. We had known each other far too long for that. He was already building the countermeasures. "I'm filing an immediate, irrevocable amendment to the trust," Harlan said, his voice falling to a low, confidential murmur, so the surrounding tables couldn't catch a word. "We are removing his name from every single clause. Conrad," he said, "Garrett will no longer serve as automatic successor trustee, nor will he hold any standing as a beneficiary of the estate in any capacity. I need you to tell me exactly where you want the assets directed upon your passing." I didn't need a moment to think. The answer had been sitting inside me for years. "Direct the entirety of the estate and all liquid assets to the Regional Veterans Housing Charity," I told him, my voice perfectly level. "Establish an endowment. Make certain the board of directors is fully insulated against any legal challenges my son might attempt to bring after I'm gone." Harlan nodded, entering the stipulations with practiced speed. A sudden, unexpected wave of peace rolled over me with that decision. My late wife Cecilia would have wanted it precisely this way. Her father had served overseas and come home carrying deep, invisible wounds that shadowed him for the rest of his life. Before Cecilia died 10 years ago, her dying wish was for us to channel a significant portion of the logistics fortune I had built into a foundation for struggling veterans. I had made her that promise, but after I buried her, grief fogged everything. I looked at Garrett, 25 years old at the time, and saw the only living fragment of Cecilia I had left. I told myself that given enough time, enough resources, and enough support, he would grow into a man capable of stewarding the estate and honoring his mother's legacy. I put the charity off. I kept Garrett as sole heir. I surrendered Cecilia's beautiful, selfless final wish in exchange for a delusion that my son would eventually find his conscience. Sitting in that vinyl diner booth, I understood I had squandered 10 years waiting on a miracle that was never coming. Garrett wasn't going to build a legacy. He was going to liquidate my life's work to settle luxury car leases and designer bills. Harlan turned the tablet around and pushed it across the sticky laminate table toward me. The screen held the dense legal language of the trust amendment. I put on my reading glasses and worked through the paragraphs. The wording was absolute. It legally severed Garrett from the $15 million fortune. It stated plainly that he was to receive nothing, effectively disinheriting him entirely and transferring full control of the estate to the Veterans Charity the moment my heart stopped. Harlan offered me a digital stylus. "I need your signature at the bottom," he said quietly. Once you sign it, uploads directly to my firm's secure server and gets time-stamped. It is legally binding the instant the stylus leaves the glass. If Garrett or his new attorney try to file a competency claim later this afternoon, this timestamp will demonstrate that you executed this amendment before any such motion was ever brought before a court. It will make his entire strategy read as a desperate retaliatory cash grab. I looked at the glowing signature line. Signing a document that cuts your only child out of your life is not a natural act. It runs against every instinct a parent has. For a fraction of a second, a picture of Garrett as a little boy surfaced in my mind, running across the lawn of our first house, laughing as I chased him through the afternoon light. But that boy was long gone. The man who took his place was currently exploring how to have me committed to a psychiatric facility so he could take my home. I took hold of the stylus and pressed it to the screen. I signed my name in firm, deliberate strokes and handed the stylus back to Harlan. "It is done," Harlan said, pressing a final button on his screen. "The trust is sealed, the house is secure. He has zero legal standing and he has no idea what is heading straight for him." I gave a slow nod and drew a long, quiet breath of the diner air. The defensive structure was fully in place. The legal shield was raised and the financial oxygen had been cut off completely. The time had come to watch what happened next. I reached into the pocket of my damp overcoat and brought out my cell phone. It had been dark since I'd been sitting in the taxi outside. The mansion switched off right after I sent that single loaded text about who truly owned the house. I pressed my thumb against the power button on the side of the device and held it. The screen came to life, the manufacturer's logo burning white against the black glass. I set the phone flat on the table between Harlan and me. We sat watching it in silence as the operating system worked its way up. The home screen appeared. For 3 agonizing seconds, the phone was perfectly still. The processor seemed to stall, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of data trying to push through at once. Then the dam gave way. A sharp, frantic chime rang through the quiet diner. Then another. Then a continuous overlapping cascade of rings, buzzes, and alert tones. The screen blazed like a slot machine, paying out a jackpot. 50 separate notifications tumbled down the glass in rapid succession. 20 missed calls from Garrett, 15 from Sienna, a flood of text messages written in capital letters and bristling with exclamation points. Voicemail alerts stacked up one after another. The financial barricades I'd constructed earlier that morning had clearly detonated inside their carefully maintained world. Their credit cards had declined. Their accounts were frozen. The panic had set in, and the situation was entirely beyond their control. The phone on that sticky diner table didn't just ring. It shook with a relentless, almost violent energy, as though the device itself was coming apart at the seams. I sat across from Harlan and watched the screen ignite with missed calls, frantic messages, and stacked voicemail alerts. The trap I had set only hours earlier had snapped completely shut. I reached over and picked up the phone. I scrolled past the torrent of text messages packed with threats and demands. Instead, I went straight to my voicemail inbox. The first message at the top was from my daughter-in-law, Sienna. I pressed play and held the speaker to my ear. Her voice bore no trace of the cold indifference she'd worn when she pushed me out into the freezing rain at 1 Wanderer in the morning. What I heard instead was a high-pitched, frantic screech. She was barely keeping her breathing under control. She was demanding to know what I had done to the Platinum Secondary card. She was standing at the register inside the downtown Italian designer boutique, the very same one where she'd attempted to drop $8,000 the moment the sun came up. Through her ragged breaths, I could pick out the faint drift of ambient store music and the murmured apologies of the sales staff. Sienna screamed that her card had been declined not once, but 3 separate times. And she hadn't gone alone. She'd brought 2 of her high society friends along for a morning shopping excursion. Women she had spent the better part of her life trying to impress. She told me she was standing at the counter, completely humiliated, holding up the line while the cashier regarded her with undisguised pity. She ordered me to call the bank and correct the problem immediately before she completely lost her composure. I lowered the phone and felt a deep, clean clarity settle over me. Sienna's obsession with how she appeared to the world had always been her sharpest vulnerability, her Achilles heel. When she first entered my son's life, I had noticed the way her eyes worked a room, quietly tallying the net worth of everyone in it. She had spent years curating a digital existence built on private jets and imported champagne, every bit of it funded by my labor. She hadn't married Garrett because he was a decent or driven man. She married him for the aesthetic of wealth, the mansion, the cars, the limitless access to a lifestyle she had never come close to earning on her own. To have that carefully constructed image collapse in public in front of the precise women she had always wanted to stand above was a fate worse than anything I could have engineered. The mask had cracked, and she was bleeding where it showed most. I deleted her message and moved to the next voicemail. This one was from Garrett. If Sienna's message was raw panic, my son's was something closer to unhinged fury. I heard the heavy rhythm of his breathing as he demanded I switch my phone on immediately. His voice was shaking rage and rising fear pulling at each other beneath the words. He shouted that his credit lines were frozen and the bank was refusing to authorize any transfers out of the operational account. He issued a threat if I didn't reverse all of this. At once, he was calling his lawyers and pushing forward with the emergency guardianship. He closed the message by screaming that I was destroying his life. I set the phone face down on the table. He still believed he held the upper hand. He still thought his conservatorship threats held real power. He had no idea that Harlan had already legally severed him from the $15 million estate. The humiliating reality of financial ruin was hammering at his door, yet he was still trying to muscle his way out of it. Harlan watched me from the other side of the booth, his face calm and measured. He took a sip of his coffee and gave a slow nod. The financial ecosystem they lived in has collapsed, Harlan said quietly. They are suffocating, and they are looking for someone to blame. I reached into my leather briefcase and drew out my silver tablet. I needed to see exactly how the collapse was unfolding in real time. I unlocked the screen and opened the secure application that tied directly into the mansion's exterior camera network. I had paid for that state-of-the-art surveillance system to keep my family safe. Now, I was using it to watch their empire come apart at the seams. I pulled up the live feed for the main driveway, aimed squarely at the heavy wrought iron front gates. The winter rain was still hammering down, smearing the camera lens a little, but the picture was clear enough. I stared at the screen as a large heavy-duty vehicle rolled into frame. It was no delivery van or neighbor's luxury sedan. It was a sleek flatbed tow truck, amber warning lights slicing through the gray morning fog. I watched in total silence as the heavy iron gates, which I had deliberately unlinked from Garrett's control panel earlier that morning, swung open on their own to admit the truck. The vehicle crept up the long, manicured driveway, heading straight for the mansion's front entrance, where Garrett's imported luxury SUV sat waiting. The consequences of my morning phone calls were arriving precisely on schedule. I kept my gaze fixed on the glowing tablet screen. The high-definition security cameras I had installed around the mansion's perimeter gave a razor-sharp view of the front driveway. The winter storm had not eased and heavy freezing rain whipped against the cobblestones. The sleek flatbed sat idling in the center of the drive, its diesel engine pushing a steady, thick plume of white exhaust that drifted lazily past the manicured hedges I once trimmed myself. The driver climbed out of the cab, yanking the collar of his neon high-visibility jacket up against the biting cold. He walked straight toward the gleaming black luxury SUV parked near the front portico. It was Garrett's pride and joy, the vehicle he drove to his elite social clubs to project the unmistakable image of a self-made corporate titan, a rolling monument to his manufactured success. And now, a man in a rain-soaked jacket was dragging a heavy steel chain across the wet asphalt, ready to hook it to the front axle. Watching those thick metal hooks latch onto the undercarriage of that outrageously expensive car pulled a very specific and painful memory to the surface of my mind. 10 years ago, when Garrett landed his very first real entry-level job out of college, I wanted to give him a foundation for lifelong success. I went to a reputable local dealership and bought him a perfectly solid, sensible sedan. I paid for it entirely in cash. I handed him the keys and told him that a man who owns his car outright answers to no one. I wanted him to know the quiet pride of debt-free ownership. Exactly 3 months later, he drove that practical, reliable car straight to a luxury foreign dealership. He traded it in as a mere down payment on a leased high-performance sports car he absolutely could not afford. That single arrogant decision locked him into an endless cycle of toxic debt. He gladly surrendered his financial freedom for the hollow illusion of status. Today that illusion was finally being towed away. On the tablet screen, the winch motor began to grind. The front wheels of the luxury vehicle lifted slowly off the wet pavement, tilting at a steep angle. Suddenly, the heavy oak front doors of the mansion burst open, Garrett sprinted out onto the wide porch in nothing but his charcoal cashmere bathrobe and a pair of worn suede slippers. He didn't even seem to register the freezing rain instantly drenching his clothes and pasting his hair flat against his forehead. He threw his arms in the air wildly at the tow truck driver, screaming at full volume. Even with the camera's audio feed off, I could read his frantic, panicked body language without any trouble. He was demanding the man drop the car immediately, waving his hands, jabbing toward the house, probably shouting about some massive bank error or a case of mistaken identity. The tow truck driver didn't flinch. He was a seasoned professional who had almost certainly dealt with hundreds of furious, entitled debtors before. He simply shook his head, produced a laminated work order from his jacket pocket, and pointed firmly at the paperwork. The automatic payment had failed. The premium insurance policy had been abruptly canceled. The vehicle was a serious financial liability, and the bank wanted their property back right now. The driver turned his back on my screaming son and walked to the controls to finish securing the chains. Behind Garrett, standing in the grand entryway of the mansion, was Sienna. She was bundled in a thick cashmere sweater, gripping a heavy enamel mug of coffee in both hands. Her posture was rigid. Her face was strikingly pale and completely stripped of its usual arrogant, mocking smirk. She was watching her husband humiliate himself in the driveway, but her eyes kept darting nervously around the property. She was watching the neighborhood come to life. The flashing amber warning lights of the tow truck were bouncing off the dark windows of the surrounding multi-million-dollar estates. The wealthy elite neighbors she had spent every waking hour trying to impress were surely peering through their expensive blinds, witnessing the very public unraveling of her perfect facade. Sienna stepped slowly backward, retreating into the deep shadows of the foyer. Understanding that her carefully constructed social standing was crumbling right before her eyes, she did not step out to stand by her husband. She left him alone in the rain. Garrett threw his hands up, pacing back and forth across the wet driveway. He leveled one last accusatory finger at the tow truck driver, then aggressively wrestled his cell phone from his soaked bathrobe pocket. He began jabbing at the screen with his thumb, his face twisted in total desperation and helpless fury. He was hunting for the one person who had always cleaned up his disasters. He was reaching for his permanent safety net. He needed the old man to make this go away. I watched him press the phone to his ear on the tablet screen. Exactly 1 second later, the device resting on the diner table between Harlan and me began to vibrate. The screen lit up, showing Garrett's name. Harlan glanced at the ringing phone and then looked back up at me, one eyebrow raised in a silent question. The Greasy Spoon diner around us carried on with its ordinary morning rhythm. The clinking of cheap silverware and the low murmur of tired truck drivers formed a stark, surreal backdrop to the complete financial destruction playing out on my digital screen. I didn't move to answer it. I settled back in the scuffed vinyl booth and let the phone ring. Once, twice, 3 times. I watched Garrett pacing in the freezing rain on the camera feed, shoulders hunched against the cold, his free hand clutching his wet hair in pure panic. I reached across the sticky laminate table and picked up the phone. I pressed the green button to accept the call. I raised the speaker to my ear, but I did not say a single word. I simply sat there breathing quietly, holding the line open. I stayed completely silent, letting the devastating, crushing weight of his situation travel across the digital space between us. I held the phone to my ear, listening to the ragged, frantic sound of my son on the other end. The background noise of the Greasy Spoon diner seemed to fall away entirely, leaving nothing but the digital transmission of Garrett's complete breakdown. He was hyperventilating, his breaths coming in short, panicked gasps as though he were literally drowning in the freezing rain I had just watched him stand in moments before. "Dad, you need to fix this right now." His voice was a taut high wire of pure desperation. "The tow truck driver is not listening to me. The bank is telling me my accounts are locked. Sienna is screaming at me. You need to transfer the money back immediately. Turn the cards back on. You are ruining my life." I sat perfectly still in the vinyl booth. I listened as his demands climbed from pleading straight into outright commands. He didn't ask how I was holding up after being driven out of my own home in the dead of night. He didn't apologize for Sienna's behavior or his own spineless silence. His entire world was caving in around him, and in his mind, I was nothing more than a negligent repairman failing to keep his luxury illusion running. I did not offer him a single word of comfort. I made no attempt to explain the legal moves Harlan and I had just finalized. I simply drew the phone away from my ear, glanced at the call timer, counting upward on the glowing screen, and pressed the red button to cut the line. The call went stone dead. I slipped the phone into my coat pocket, thanked Harlan for his swift legal work, and walked out of the diner. The freezing winter rain was still sheeting down, scouring the grime from the industrial streets. I got into my rental car and drove the short distance back to the highway motel. When I shouldered open the thin, hollow door of my room, a wall of stale, damp air hit me. The place smelled of harsh chemical cleaner and old cigarette smoke papering over years of neglect. I shook off my wet overcoat and draped it across the back of the plastic desk chair. I lowered myself onto the edge of the sagging mattress, feeling the broken springs bite into my back, taking in the peeling wallpaper and the stuttering fluorescent bulb above the bathroom sink. And then, unexpectedly, a sudden powerful wave of nostalgia washed over me. This dingy, depressing room didn't make me feel beaten down. It carried me back 40 years to when I was a young man in my 30s trying to build my logistics company from a single rusted delivery van into a functioning regional fleet. I had lived in rooms exactly like this one. I spent countless nights on terrible mattresses just off the interstate, pulling thin blankets tight to stretch every possible penny. I ate cold canned soup for dinner so I could make payroll for my drivers the next morning. I worked until my hands cracked and my spine ached, breathing diesel fumes and cheap motel soap for a decade straight. I built a $15 million empire on a foundation of relentless, gritty sacrifice. The rain outside began coming down harder, slapping against the single-pane glass in a steady drumming rhythm. It was the same kind of bitter, freezing rain I had pushed through decades ago, hauling freight across state lines, while the rest of the world slept warm in their beds. I had endured that biting cold so my family would never have to shiver. I had surrendered my own comfort to build a fortress of security around my wife and my son. And this was my grand reward. A son who saw my life as nothing more than an account to be emptied. A son who would lock me out in the very same cold I had spent a lifetime shielding him from. Garrett had never once seen that version of me. By the time he was old enough to understand the world, the empire was already standing. He grew up in the sprawling suburban mansion, sleeping on imported silk sheets, and eating meals laid out by private caterers. He had always assumed wealth was a natural right, a magical resource that simply floated in the air, ready to be drawn in with every breath. He was, at this moment, squandering the very empire I had traded my youth to construct, and doing it with a breathtaking absence of gratitude. The sharp contrast between my early years scraping by in rooms just like this one and his current entitled meltdown only deepened the cold resolve sitting in my chest. I reached into my pocket and took my phone back out. I needed to make sure my digital trail was completely erased. I went into the privacy settings and felt a sharp jolt of frustration I had forgotten to disable the location sharing feature. Garrett had insisted on linking our family accounts years back, claiming it was a safety measure. I immediately switched the setting off, cutting the digital tracking signal. But as I watched the icon vanish from the top of the screen, a heavy realization settled over me. He had been staring at his phone in full panic for the past hour. If he had checked the location tracking app before I killed it, he already had my last known ping. I set the phone down on the nightstand and waited. I did not switch on the television. I did not pace the floor. I simply sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the rain hammer the cheap window glass, gathering myself for the physical confrontation I knew was on its way. 2 hours went by in complete silence. Then the stillness of the motel room was blown apart by a violent, explosive noise. It wasn't a polite knock. It was heavy, aggressive pounding that rattled the thin wooden door inside its cheap metal frame. The force of the blows actually shook the flimsy security chain, holding the door shut from the inside. I didn't flinch. I rose slowly, smoothing the creases from my trousers. I moved toward the door, my steps silent on the damp carpet. I didn't reach for the handle. I stood perfectly still, letting him burn through his first burst of fury. The pounding broke off for a brief moment, replaced by the sound of ragged, frantic breathing filtering through the narrow hallway outside. Then my son's voice came crashing through the thin wood, loud enough to wake half the motel. "Open up! I know you're in there. I tracked your phone before you switched it off." He drove his fist into the door again, the wood groaning from the impact. He had given up any pretense of playing the concerned son. He was a cornered, desperate animal, and his true nature was bleeding through every word. "Open this door right now. I am your legal guardian. You're not well, Dad, and you need to hand over the account passwords before I call the police and have you dragged out of here." I stood inches from the door, listening to him weaponize my age and my health in a pathetic bid to get back into my wallet. He genuinely believed he could intimidate me. He thought that screaming legal threats through a cheap motel door would crack my resolve. He had absolutely no idea that the man standing on the other side of that door was not a sick, helpless victim. I was the architect of his destruction, and I was entirely prepared to open the door and let the full weight of his situation land squarely on him. I unlatched the cheap metal chain and turned the deadbolt. The click sounded unnaturally sharp in the small, cramped room. I pulled the door open just wide enough to fill the threshold, blocking the entrance with my body. The frigid winter air rushed in at once, carrying the bitter smell of wet asphalt, damp clothing, and cheap exhaust fumes, drifting in from the nearby highway. Garrett stood in the narrow exterior corridor, shaking hard. He looked absolutely pitiful. The charcoal cashmere bathrobe was gone. He had carelessly thrown a wrinkled designer overcoat over a pair of sweatpants and shoved his feet into expensive leather loafers that were being slowly destroyed by the freezing rain. His hair was plastered flat against his forehead, his chest heaving as he fought for breath. He suddenly lunged forward, trying to use his size and momentum to muscle past me into the room. I did not give an inch. I planted my feet on the faded carpet and locked my eyes onto his. For one brief moment, he looked genuinely startled that a 72-year-old man could hold his ground so firmly against someone half his age. He stumbled back slightly, wiping cold rain from his face, his arrogance cracking just for a second. "You need to pack your things right now," Garrett ordered, his voice strung tight with panic and hollow authority. "I'm taking you back to the house. You're clearly in the middle of some kind of serious psychological episode. You froze my accounts and canceled the insurance policies because you're confused. You don't even know what you're doing." I held his stare, letting his desperate lies hang in the frozen air between us. He was trying to gaslight me to my face. He actually believed he could bend reality simply by speaking his delusions out loud. It was a tactic that had worked on his wife, on his wealthy friends, on his business associates for years. But he was forgetting that I was the man who taught him how to talk. When I still didn't respond, his tone pushed into open aggression. He leveled a trembling, rain-soaked finger directly at my chest. "If you don't give me the passwords to unlock the operational accounts, right this second, I'm calling my lawyers. I already spoke to them this morning. Before we go any further, what's coming next is where everything my son had truly set in motion finally comes to the surface. The weight of it nearly stopped me cold. I'll ask you this while you still have a moment to think. If someone you loved was quietly working to take everything from you, would you confront them the moment you knew, or would you move in silence until the trap was set? We are filing an emergency competency lawsuit today. A judge will look at what you did this morning, canceling everything without warning, and declare you completely unfit to manage your own affairs. You will be placed under my legal guardianship by the end of the week. You will have no control over anything." He stood there shaking in his ruined designer's shoes, waiting for me to fall apart. He expected me to buckle under the terrifying weight of losing my autonomy. He expected the old man to apologize, drop his head, and surrender the keys to the kingdom, just as I had done after his mother died. I looked at the son I had raised. I looked at the man who had spent his entire adult life taking everything I gave him and demanding more. A profound, icy calm settled deep into my bones. The fear he was trying to plant in me simply glanced off the armor I had forged over the past few hours. "I don't need a psychological evaluation, Garrett," I said, my voice dropping to a low, even register that cut cleanly through the noise of the falling rain. "What I need is a son who isn't buried under a $60,000 illegal sports betting debt in Atlantic City." The color drained from his face instantly. The arm that had been jabbing aggressively toward my chest dropped slowly to his side as though the muscles had simply quit. The arrogant, threatening posture collapsed entirely, replaced by the terrified stance of a cornered thief whose darkest secret had just been hauled out into daylight. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. I didn't give him a moment to recover. I leaned slightly forward, making sure every syllable reached him clearly above the storm. A year ago, I noticed strange irregularities in the joint operational accounts. Large, unexplained cash withdrawals, wire transfers going to obscure shell companies. I didn't want to believe my own son was stealing from the family. I desperately wanted to be wrong. So I hired a private investigator, quietly hoping he'd come back and tell me my suspicions were nothing but the paranoid fears of a grieving old man. I watched his eyes go wide in absolute horror as the full weight of my words sank in. Instead, the investigator returned with an enormous file documenting your illegal debt. I continued keeping my voice completely flat. I know about the offshore betting accounts. I know about the aggressive, unsavory lenders you owe money to. I know that you have been raiding my logistics fortune to desperately paper over your gambling losses while performing the role of self-made titan at your exclusive country club. You didn't drive to this motel today because you're worried about my mental health. You came here because you're terrified that the people you owe money to are going to break your legs when you miss your payments this coming Friday. The freezing wind tore through the open doorway, but Garrett was visibly sweating. His chest heaved as his mind raced. He had climbed the steps to this motel room convinced he held the ultimate trump card. He thought the threat of a forced conservatorship would frighten me into submission. Instead, I had just spread his most closely guarded, most dangerous secrets across the dirty concrete walkway for the world to hear. For a long, excruciating moment, we simply stared at each other. I watched the last traces of the boy I had raised dissolve completely into the cold air. The illusion of the dutiful, loving son was gone for good. The mask peeled away entirely, exposing the ruthless, desperate parasite that had been hiding beneath it all along. A slow, dark sneer spread across his wet face. His expression warped into something so deeply ugly and venomous that he looked like a total stranger standing in front of me. "You think you're so incredibly smart," Garrett spat, his voice soaked in pure, unfiltered malice. "You think cutting off the credit cards and freezing the accounts is going to stop me? Keep your cash, old man. I don't need your operational funds anymore." He took a step backward, pulling his wet overcoat tight around his shoulders. He fixed me with a triumphant, mocking stare that sent a brief ripple of unease through my gut. "I've already listed the mansion for a private cash sale." He sneered, lips curling into a wicked, greedy smile. "It's the family estate, and it's in my name as your only heir. I have wealthy cash buyers touring the property right now as we speak. I'll have $2 million in liquid cash wired directly into my personal accounts by Friday afternoon. You can sit in this filthy motel room and rot for all I care. The house is mine." He spun on his heel, his ruined leather shoes slapping heavily through the deep puddles on the concrete walkway. He didn't look back. He stormed off toward his vehicle, leaving me alone in the motel doorway. I watched him vanish into the gray winter storm. He truly believed he had secured his final victory. He believed he had found a clever loophole to outflank my financial blockade and steal the crown jewel of everything I had built. I eased the heavy wooden door shut, cutting off the freezing rain and the sound of his retreating steps. I crossed back to the small laminate desk and picked up my cell phone to call Harlan. The final trap had just been sprung. I stood motionless in the center of that cramped motel room, listening to the freezing rain drive against the thin glass. My son's parting words bounced off the peeling wallpaper. He had declared with breathtaking arrogance that he had already put my mansion on the market for a private cash sale. He genuinely believed he was going to have $2 million wired into his personal accounts by Friday afternoon. I moved to the small laminate desk and lowered myself into the hard plastic chair. I refused to let panic crowd out rational thought. I opened my laptop and brought the screen to life, the harsh blue glow cutting through the dark room. I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out my cell phone, and dialed my attorney's direct line. Harlan picked up on the second ring. I kept my voice perfectly level as I walked him through exactly what had just played out on the concrete walkway outside my room. My son's desperate physical state, his wrecked designer clothes, and the venomous threat he had made about the estate. I told Harlan that Garrett claimed the house was already on the active market and that cash buyers were touring the property at that very moment. As we talked, I could hear the rhythmic clicking of a keyboard over the line as Harlan absorbed the information. He said it sounded like a frantic bluff engineered to frighten me into unfreezing his credit lines. I told Harlan that my son was a creature of desperate vanity and that he would absolutely try to liquidate anything within reach to save his own skin from his gambling debts. I told Harlan to pull up the active high-end real estate listings for our specific county. We stayed on the line in complete silence as we both pulled up the most exclusive property portals in the region. I typed in the address of the sprawling suburban estate I had called home for decades. The results loaded immediately. My stomach clenched into a sharp, painful knot as a high-resolution photograph of my own wrought iron front gates filled the laptop screen. He wasn't bluffing at all. The mansion was actively listed and open for offers. I clicked into the property profile and began scrolling through the details. The asking price was absurdly low, deliberately slashed to a fraction of actual market value to guarantee a fast, unquestioned transaction. The bold text in the description read, "Gifted family estate available for rapid cash sale only." The real estate copy was written with a sickening layer of manufactured charm. It boasted about the pristine Italian marble floors I had imported for my wife and the custom crystal chandeliers she had so carefully chosen. It called out the manicured grounds where I had planted roses in her memory. The listing agent promised a seamless closing for the right cash buyer. My own son was publicly trying to fence the last remaining monument to his mother's memory, like a stolen watch dropped at a pawn shop simply to bury his illicit debts. A wave of nausea rolled over me as I understood just how effortlessly he was prepared to erase our entire history for a quick payout. I read the listing details aloud to Harlan over the phone. He let out a low, humorless laugh. He asked whether my son had completely lost his grip on reality. I told Harlan that Garrett had always operated under a lifetime of unchecked delusions. For years he had lived in that massive house, throwing lavish parties and playing the wealthy lord of the manor for his circle of elite friends. He assumed that because I had always allowed him to treat the property as his own, he held some automatic inherent right to it. He fundamentally believed that, as my only child, the physical deed was his, the very moment he decided he needed the cash. He was tragically mistaken. I explained to Harlan that my son had completely overlooked the foundational legal structure governing our family assets. The deed to that magnificent house was never in my personal name, and it was certainly never going to be in his. The property was held exclusively by the Cecilia Merritt Trust. When I purchased that estate many years ago, I placed it inside a secure ironclad trust, named after my late wife, specifically to guard it against exactly this kind of reckless financial behavior. My son could list that house on every website in the country, and it wouldn't matter. He had no legal authority to sell a single blade of grass on that front lawn. I told Harlan we needed to contact the listing broker immediately and shut this absurd circus down before anyone actually signed a contract, but Harlan told me to wait. The clicking of his keyboard grew faster and considerably more intense. He told me he was digging into the public county clerk database to find out exactly what documentation my son had submitted to the real estate agency to get the listing approved in the first place. A reputable broker would ordinarily demand ironclad proof of ownership before putting a multi-million-dollar property on the open market. The silence on the line stretched into a long, agonizing minute. The only sound in that miserable motel room was the steady rattle of the old wall heater fighting the winter cold. Then Harlan finally spoke, and his voice had shed every trace of its usual composed professionalism. His tone carried real alarm. He told me to refresh the real estate page and look at the digital attachments section at the very bottom of the property listing. I scrolled down and clicked on a small blue link labeled Legal Disclosures. A scanned document opened on my screen. It was not a property deed. It was an official filing from the county family court. I worked through the dense legal text and my blood went absolutely cold. My son hadn't merely listed the house behind my back. He had filed an emergency injunction early that same morning, while I had been busy freezing his credit cards. The document, submitted under strict penalty of perjury, claimed I was suffering from severe advanced dementia. The fraudulent filing stated that I was prone to violent, unpredictable psychotic episodes and posed an immediate danger to myself and everyone in my vicinity. It painted the picture of a broken, confused old man, no longer capable of meeting his own basic needs. But the final paragraph was the most terrifying thing I had read in my 72 years. It formally petitioned the county court to grant my son immediate temporary power of attorney over all my medical and financial decisions. He was attempting to bypass the secure trust entirely by having me legally declared a mental incompetent and seizing absolute control over every dimension of my life. The cramped motel room suddenly felt like a cage closing in. I stared at the legal document glowing on my laptop screen. My own son had filed an emergency injunction in the county family court, claiming I was a violent danger to myself and suffering from advanced dementia. He was actively petitioning a judge to strip away my basic human rights and hand him total dominion over my physical and financial existence. The sheer audacity of the lie was breathtaking. Harlan didn't waste a single second expressing shock. He snapped his laptop shut and pushed it into his leather briefcase. He He looked at me with urgent intensity and said we were in a race against the clock. If a sympathetic judge signed that emergency order without hearing our side, my son could legally dispatch police to this very motel to collect me and have me committed to a psychiatric facility. We needed unassailable medical proof of my sanity, and we needed it immediately. I grabbed my Dampa overcoat and followed Harlan out into the freezing winter storm. The drive to the city medical center was tense and wordless. The tires of Harlan's sedan hissed along the flooded asphalt, while the windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the heavy downpour. I stared out the passenger window, watching the gray city smear past. A deep, heavy sorrow had settled into my bones. Aging is a strange and brutal process. You spend your whole life constructing an empire carrying the weight of hundreds of employees, managing complex operations day after day. Your mind is a sharp instrument built for solving crises. Yet the moment your hair turns white and your pace slows, the world decides you are a target. Your own flesh and blood looks at your decades of hard-won wisdom and sees nothing but weakness, a soft mark ready to be taken apart and used. My son was turning my age into a weapon, exploiting the natural passage of time as a tool to plunder my life. I tightened my grip on the door handle, refusing to let his malicious fiction become my reality. We pulled up to the towering glass and steel medical complex in the heart of the city. We moved quickly through the bright, sterile lobby, bypassing the crowded waiting areas, and rode the elevator straight to the private executive health wing on the top floor. We were there to see Dr. Okafor, chief of internal medicine and my primary physician for over 30 years. More importantly, he was the man who had stood beside me during the darkest chapter of my life. 10 years ago, when my wife Cecilia was fighting her final losing battle against illness, Dr. Okafor had managed her care. He spent countless hours in our hospital room, walking us through treatments and offering real comfort when the medicine stopped working. He knew the depth of my grief, and he knew the strength of my character. He knew without any shadow of doubt that my mind was sharper than most men half my age. Dr. Okafor was reviewing patient files in his spacious corner office when his receptionist showed us in. He looked up surprised by the unannounced visit, but his expression shifted quickly to deep concern when he took in the grim determination on our faces. Harlan stepped forward and laid out the dire legal situation in quick, precise terms. He described the fraudulent court filing and explained that we needed a comprehensive, expedited cognitive evaluation conducted on the spot, along with a signed, notarized medical certificate confirming that I was fully competent and in complete command of my mental faculties. Dr. Okafor asked no unnecessary questions. He recognized the gravity of the threat and cleared his schedule for the next hour without hesitation. I settled into the stiff leather examination chair, while Dr. Okafor produced a standard cognitive assessment protocol. For the next 45 minutes, I underwent a rigorous battery of mental tests. It was deeply humiliating to be made to prove my own sanity simply because a greedy child wanted to dig himself out of debt. But I channeled every bit of my mounting anger into absolute total focus. I worked through complex mathematical equations without a moment's hesitation. I recited long sequences of random numbers forward and backward. I reproduced intricate geometric shapes from memory and picked apart logical puzzles with the same ruthless efficiency I once used to negotiate corporate freight contracts. I didn't stumble once. My mind moved like a perfectly tuned instrument, cutting through each section of the assessment with clean precision. When the evaluation was finished, Dr. Okafor set his clipboard on his desk and looked at me with a warm, reassuring smile. He said, my cognitive function was not merely normal, it was exceptional. He turned to his computer and composed a comprehensive medical declaration laying out the full examination results. He printed it on official hospital letterhead and signed his name at the bottom with a firm stroke of a heavy black pen. Harlan took the document immediately and secured it inside his briefcase. The legal shield was forged. We now held the definitive weapon to dismantle the fraudulent court injunction and protect my autonomy. The suffocating anxiety that had gripped my chest since I first saw the real estate listing began to ease. I stood and extended my hand to thank Dr. Okafor for dropping everything to come to my defense. But as he shook it, his professional smile faded entirely. He motioned for Harlan and me to sit back down in the chairs across from his desk. The atmosphere in that bright office turned suddenly heavy and cold. Dr. Okafor removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes, his expression deeply troubled. He looked directly at me and spoke in a low, measured voice that sent a fresh wave of ice straight through me. He said he was glad we had come in today because there was something deeply disturbing he needed to tell me. He drew a slow breath and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. Your son came into this very office 3 days ago. Dr. Okafor let his words drop like heavy stones into the quiet room. He requested a private consultation regarding your health. He sat right where you are sitting now and told me you were completely losing your mind. He claimed you were becoming violent and that he needed to protect the family. Then he reached into his jacket, pulled out a thick envelope of cash, and offered me $10,000 right on the spot to falsify a medical record and officially diagnose you with severe advanced dementia. Leaving the medical center, I felt a profound shift take hold deep inside my chest. The sorrow of a betrayed father was swept aside, entirely replaced by the cold calculation of a businessman preparing for a hostile takeover. Dr. Okafor had provided the official medical clearance along with a signed affidavit documenting my son's attempt to purchase a fraudulent dementia diagnosis for $10,000. Harlan secured the papers in his leather briefcase. The legal shield was now loaded with absolute proof of criminal intent. We climbed back into my attorney's sedan. The winter storm had finally started to break, leaving a cold, flat gray afternoon in its wake. I told Harlan to drive directly to the main branch of my primary bank in the financial district. I needed the ultimate trump card to completely demolish the delusional real estate listing my son had posted online. We bypassed the crowded teller lines and were escorted down to the heavily secured vault area in the basement. The thick steel door of the vault swung open with a heavy click, the sound rolling through the quiet metallic corridor. I walked along the aisle and located my personal safety deposit box. I slid my key into the lock and drew out the long metal drawer. Inside, tucked beneath a stack of old corporate bonds and tax records, sat a thick manila envelope. I opened it and lifted out the original physical deed to the suburban mansion. The heavy parchment felt rough and substantial between my fingers. Holding it brought a sudden rush of vivid memory. I could still see the exact afternoon I signed this document decades ago. I had just secured my first major international freight contract. I bought that massive estate outright in cash to give my late wife Cecilia the sprawling garden she had always dreamed of. I made certain the deed was placed directly into a secure trust to protect her future and guard our family from outside threats. This piece of parchment was not simply a record of property, it was the physical manifestation of my entire legacy. Holding it in my hands at that moment, it did not feel like a memory, it felt like a loaded weapon. I set the original deed down on the private viewing table inside the vault room. Harlan opened his briefcase and methodically laid out the rest of our ammunition. We arranged the documents side by side under the bright fluorescent lights. We had the irrevocable trust amendment cutting my son out of the estate entirely. We had the unassailable medical certificate from the chief of internal medicine confirming my full cognitive fitness. We had the sworn affidavit detailing the criminal attempt to bribe a medical professional. And now we had the original watermarked physical deed, proving beyond any doubt that my son held zero legal right to sell my home. Harlan looked down at the carefully arranged legal portfolio. He nodded slowly, his composed professional manner giving way to an expression of genuine predatory satisfaction. He told me we possessed enough documented evidence not only to have the fraudulent conservatorship injunction thrown out, but to have my son arrested for criminal conspiracy and fraud. We gathered the papers, placed them securely into a heavy binder, and walked out of the bank vault ready to execute our final move. We returned to the car and sat in the leather seats with the engine running, the heater blowing steadily. Harlan opened his silver tablet to review the legal filing schedule. He planned to submit the medical clearance and the trust amendment to the county clerk without delay. That action would effectively neutralize the emergency family court injunction my son had filed that morning. I watched the digital clock on the dashboard, aware that we were about to dismantle my son's entire constructed world before the sun went down. Just as Harlan opened the digital portal to upload the files, a sharp alert chime cut through the quiet cabin of the sedan. It was a push notification from the exclusive real estate application Harlan had downloaded earlier that morning to keep an eye on the active listing of my mansion. Harlan tapped the notification banner, his eyes moving quickly across the updated property profile. I watched his jaw tighten. The trace of satisfaction drained from his face, replaced by sudden, sharp urgency. He turned the tablet toward me. My son had not simply left the property sitting online to collect digital inquiries. He had aggressively accelerated his timeline to liquidate the estate. The listing had been updated with a bold red banner stretched across the top of the screen. The text announced that the property was hosting an exclusive invite-only open house, strictly for verified cash buyers and private investment groups, seeking an immediate expedited closing. My son was actively trying to fence my home that very day. He was working to lock in a substantial non-refundable cash deposit before the weekend, desperately hoping to use that stolen capital to clear his dangerous gambling debts in Atlantic City. I looked closer at the event details, and my stomach dropped as I read the scheduled time. The private showing was not set for tomorrow. It was not scheduled for that evening. The text stated plainly that the open house was due to begin in exactly 1 hour. The wealthy buyers were already on their way to my property, driving toward my home, ready to walk across my imported marble floors and negotiate a fraudulent cash deal with a man who didn't own a single brick of the foundation. Harlan tossed the tablet onto the passenger seat and shifted the car into gear immediately. There was no time to sit in a parking lot uploading documents to a slow county clerk portal. If my son accepted a cash deposit from a private buyer, it would generate a tangled legal mess that could take years to unravel in civil court. We had to cut it off at the source. We had to confront the delusion head-on. The legal guillotine was fully assembled. It was time to drop the blade. I watched the city streets blur past the passenger window as Harlan steered the sedan away from the financial district. We guided the car toward the affluent retail corridor, where the city's most prestigious businesses operated. The winter storm clouds were finally beginning to fracture and pull apart, but the atmosphere inside the cabin stayed tightly wound. We were not heading to the mansion just yet. If we were going to tear down my son's illusion completely, we needed to begin by dismantling the people actively propping it up. We pulled up in front of a sleek glass and steel building that housed the most exclusive luxury real estate brokerage in the county. This was the agency my son had chosen to market my home, the firm currently facilitating the fraudulent open house, relying on forged documents and a blind deference to my son's manufactured social standing. I stepped out of the car and buttoned my damp overcoat. My boots struck the wet pavement with heavy, deliberate purpose. Stepping through the pristine glass doors of the brokerage, I was immediately hit by the thick scent of expensive leather and artisan coffee. The lobby had been designed to make ordinary people feel small. It was a towering monument to surface wealth's soaring ceilings, and enormous digital displays cycling endlessly through multi-million-dollar property listings. A young receptionist behind a vast slab of imported marble looked up at us with a practiced, condescending smile. She asked politely whether we had an appointment with an agent. Harlan didn't break stride. He walked directly to her desk, placed both hands flat on the pristine marble surface, and informed her that we were not there to schedule a property tour. He instructed her to bring the managing broker out immediately and to let him know that the true legal owner of the Merritt estate had arrived. The receptionist's practiced smile evaporated on the spot. She snatched up her desk phone and murmured a string of urgent words into the receiver. Less than a minute later, a tall man in a tailored Italian suit came through a frosted glass office at the back of the room. He crossed the floor, projecting an air of complete authority. His gold name badge identified him as Mr. Whitaker, the senior managing partner of the firm. He glanced at Harlan, then shifted his eyes to me. I watched a remarkable transformation unfold in real time. Whitaker stopped dead in the middle of the lobby floor. The smooth, dismissive smile vanished from his face entirely. He blinked several times, staring at me as though he had just watched a ghost walk through his front door. He did not see a confused, senile old man. Whitaker was a man carved from an older era of commerce, someone who had devoted his career to serving the genuine financial aristocracy of this city. The local business journals were practically scripture to him. He had no trouble placing my face. He understood he was looking at the man who had turned a single rusted truck into a dominant regional logistics empire over 4 decades, commanding the commercial freight industry, until my name alone was synonymous with untouchable success. "Mr. Merritt," Whitaker said, the arrogance evaporating from his voice as it dropped a full register. "Meeting you in person is a genuine privilege, sir. Your spread in the Trade Gazette, I remember that piece clearly." I gave him nothing back, no handshake, no nod. I fixed him with a flat, hard stare and said we needed his private conference room. Now. He swallowed and moved fast, leading us into a glass-walled, soundproof office above the street traffic below. The door swung shut behind us. He made a gesture toward the coffee station, but Harlan didn't let him finish the sentence. Harlan's briefcase was already open, and he began setting our evidence down on the polished table, one item at a time, in total silence, methodical, unhurried, devastating. The first document was the signed medical certificate from the Chief of Internal Medicine, certifying that my mind was completely sound. After that came the irrevocable trust amendment, the one that legally cut my son out of the entire $15 million estate without recourse. Then I reached into my coat and produced the thick manila envelope I had retrieved from the bank vault. The original watermark deed to the suburban mansion went sliding across the table toward him. I told him to read the name on the master deed carefully. He bent forward over it. What little color remained in his face simply left. He went pale in a matter of seconds, the sick recognition of a catastrophic miscalculation crossing his features. He had let junior agents put a multi-million-dollar property on the market on the strength of nothing but the word of a desperate gambling addict. He had trusted my son because my son showed up in a leased luxury sports car wearing expensive watches. I laid out the extent of his error without raising my voice by a single degree. My son, I told him, was at that very moment running a private cash-only open house at my estate, operating under the flag of this very brokerage. He had no legal standing whatsoever to sell that property, and every contract his firm had prepared represented direct involvement in a massive federal fraud. Furthermore, my son had gone to family court, claiming I was mentally incapacitated by severe dementia. The document currently sitting on Whitaker's own table made that claim a lie in black and white. The sweat started then. It gathered on his forehead in small, visible beads as the scope of the damage broke across him. The headlines, the license board, the years of reputation dissolving over a single reckless transaction. A fraud case of this size played out in the local press would not just bruise his agency, it would end it. He stumbled through some weak explanation about his firm having relied on the documents my son submitted. I leaned across the table and told him plainly, placing your trust in a liar carries a very steep price tag. And unless he wanted to find out exactly what that price was, he needed to understand that I would be filing full criminal charges against every party to this scheme before the sun went down. That cracked him. Whitaker's composure collapsed entirely. He understood with sudden clarity that the transaction had to be stopped before a buyer handed my son so much as $1 of non-refundable deposit. He lunged for the telephone on his desk, fingers shaking badly as he stabbed the speaker button and started dialing the mansion to order his agents to shut the whole thing down and pull the listing. He almost got there. Harlan's hand came down across the table. Harlan covered Whitaker's trembling hand with his own large, steady, immovable, and stopped him from reaching that final digit. He looked at the broker with a cold, quiet smile. "Don't call him." Harlan said the words coming out low and unhurried, carrying through the glass like a warning. "We'll deliver the news ourselves." Whitaker slowly withdrew from the phone. He had understood perfectly. He nodded, face emptied of everything, and sank back into his chair. We left every copy of every document right there on the table, a concrete record of exactly what his exposure looked like. Then, I turned away from him and walked out Harlan at my shoulder. We pushed through the glass building's front door and out into the raw afternoon cold. Every one of my son's protectors had been accounted for, shaken down and rendered harmless. The insulation he had built around himself was gone. He was standing alone now. We climbed back into the sedan. Harlan turned the key and we pulled out. Less than 20 minutes to the estate. I watched through the passenger window as the city fell away behind us and the wide familiar avenues of the county's wealthiest neighborhoods rose up in its place roads. I had traveled more times than I could count over the past several decades. The man who had crept into a damp cab and fled this neighborhood at 1 hour in the morning felt like a stranger to me now. The man riding back was different. I was the architect of this moment, and I was riding in to lay the blade of that reality across my son's neck. A glance at the dashboard clock confirmed it. The open house was running right now. Buyers in good suits were moving through my room swirling champagne, talking numbers with a man who held title to nothing. We were going to walk through those heavy oak doors and make that plain to every single one of them. The total drive from the luxury real estate brokerage clocked in at exactly 18 minutes. Harlan worked the sedan through the tree-lined curve separating the city from the county's wealthiest pockets. I watched the stone walls and trimmed hedges stream past the glass, a route I must have traveled thousands of times across 2 decades. There was a time when this drive meant something different. I'd be heading back from a long stretch managing freight logistics worn out, ready for the stillness of the home I had made for my wife. This time, I was heading back as someone come to settle accounts. We swung onto my street and everything my son had set in motion was right there in plain sight. The massive wrought iron gates at the head of the driveway were thrown all the way open. The cobblestones were buried under luxury vehicles. Sleek silver sports cars, heavy black SUVs, imported sedans sitting parked haphazardly in every direction. It had the look of a society function that had wandered into the wrong Thursday afternoon. My son had delivered exactly the audience he wanted, the most aggressive cash buyers in the region, lured in with the promise of a fast off-book deal on a flagship property. Harlan eased the sedan to the far edge of the drive, well clear of the tangle of expensive cars. We climbed out into the bite of the winter air. The rain was finished. The grounds looked clean and sharp in the gray light, every surface washed. I stood there and took in the brick facade rising above me, that massive face I had watched go up, stone by stone. I thought of the day Cecilia and I crossed the threshold for the first time. Every foot of this place had been paid for in years of work. Watching strangers pick through it like it was something on offer at a weekend sale sent a cold, settled fury moving through me. We went up the wide stone steps to the front. The double oak doors stood propped open, an invitation extended freely to every buyer who'd showed up. I didn't go in. I put my hand up and held Harlan back with me, the two of us staying in the shadow of the deep front portico. I needed to see it first. I needed to see how my son and his wife were selling this fiction before I walked in and burned it down. The portico gave me a clean line of sight straight through the foyer and into the formal living room. The place was full investors, circulating voices, low heads tilting toward the ceilings and the moldings. Commanding the center of it all, working the room, like she owned every inch, was my daughter-in-law Sienna. White tailored suit, hair set without a strand out of place, a crystal tray of champagne flutes balanced in her hands. She drifted from one cluster of suits to the next, pressing drinks on them, working that smile she had clearly rehearsed. Her voice rose above the general murmur and reached me clearly. She had positioned herself near the grand staircase with a pair of developers, and she was performing effortlessly. A light laugh, a practiced tilt of the head, and she told them that she and Garrett had simply decided to scale back, that a property this size no longer fit where they were in life, and they were ready to let the right family carry it forward. The sheer ease of it was something to behold. She talked about this house as though she had broken the ground herself, as though any of its future was hers to give away. My gaze tracked upward, pulled along by the line of Sienna's manicured finger. Her finger was aimed upward at the enormous, intricate crystal chandelier suspended from the arching dome of the foyer. Something clenched hard and painful inside my chest. That chandelier was not a light fixture. Years ago, I had made a secret trip to Italy, tracked down a master glass artisan in Venice, and commissioned it personally. It came across the ocean in a crate and was hung in the dead of night, a surprise anniversary gift for Cecilia. The first time she saw it lit, she cried. It was the finest thing I ever put inside that house, chosen entirely for her. And now Sienna was dangling my late wife's anniversary gift in front of a room full of investors, like a sweetener in a back alley negotiation. I heard her tell them that if a strong cash offer landed before the afternoon was out, she and Garrett would happily leave the imported Italian chandelier in place as a show of goodwill. She was trading my wife's memory to grease a fraudulent deal. On the far side of the room near the grand marble fireplace stood Garrett. He had a glass of scotch leaning casually against the mantelpiece and was deep in conversation with a well-dressed man clutching a leather portfolio. Garrett was playing the part of the seasoned property owner without missing a beat, sweeping gestures talk of wire transfers and closing windows the whole performance. He looked at ease, comfortable, completely unaware that every layer of protection he had built around himself had already been stripped away on the other side of town. He still believed the emergency injunction had done its job. In his mind, I was rotting in a highway motel, legally neutered while he wrapped up the biggest theft of his life. I had seen enough. The sheer unearned confidence on display had pushed past what I could stomach. I turned to Harlan, who stood at my side in the shadow of the portico, briefcase held firm in his grip. He met my eyes and gave one short, certain nod. We were ready for whatever came next. I stepped out of the shadows and moved straight to the center of the open doorway. There was no slipping in quietly. I put both palms flat against the heavy oak doors and drove them back until the brass hinges let out a groan against the stone walls. The crack of the wood hitting the masonry rang through the foyer like a shot. I crossed the threshold and set my boots down on the imported marble floor, shoulders back, full height. Every bit of authority I had forged across a lifetime of hard commercial warfare held in my posture. I did not look like a confused old man with dementia. I looked like the man who built the estate standing in the middle of it, having come to collect what was his. The reaction was immediate. The thud of the doors pulled a few eyes toward the entrance, and then the recognition moved through the room like a current. The murmur of investor conversation began to drop away. Champagne glasses stilled. Inside 5 seconds, the whole animated energy of the open house had simply died. A dense, pressing quiet settled over the grand living room as every head turned to face the man in the doorway. The echo of the doors faded into nothing, and the silence that replaced it was total. Not one person moved. The cash buyers, the developers, the socialites, all of them frozen mid-word eyes fixed on me. I held my ground. Standing in my damp winter overcoat boots solid on the marble, I looked straight across the room at my son. Garrett was by the fireplace, his expensive glass of scotch stopped halfway to his lips. The blood left his face, fast pulling his skin toward a sick, waxy pallor. For just a moment, the mask slipped, the polished property magnate vanished, and what showed through was the raw, unguarded terror of a man who has just been caught. But Garrett has always been a creature of reflex and vanity. His whole survival kit is built from shameless, fast-moving deception. I watched him pull a breath, set the glass down hard on the marble mantelpiece, and start moving toward me, across the Persian rugs. The white shock on his face was already converting itself into a flush of angry color. He arranged his expression into something wide and apologetic, performing for every investor in the room, projecting the image of a devoted son managing a painful family situation with grace. He lifted his hands in a show of calm and addressed the crowd in a voice pitched to carry to every corner of my home. He asked the ladies and gentlemen to excuse the interruption from his father. With a tone engineered to sound sorrowful, he announced that I was gravely ill, deeply confused, suffering from advanced cognitive decline. He told the room, without a flicker of hesitation, that my condition had worsened sharply over the past weeks, and that he and Sienna were in the difficult and heartbreaking process of arranging a placement for me at a secure medical facility. He told the buyers not to be alarmed. I had simply wandered off, and he would see to things personally. He was standing in the middle of my house, publicly dismantling my sanity, turning my age into a weapon, all to keep his fraudulent sale alive. While Garrett worked the room with his speech, I looked past him and found Sienna. She was fixed in place near the grand staircase, the silver tray of champagne flutes still in her hands. Her face had gone completely still, the portrait of a woman who knows the ground has just opened beneath her feet. She was aware that I had no dementia. She knew exactly what she had done when she packed 2 battered canvas duffel bags and put me out at 1 Zur in the morning. She read my expression and understood without any words that the old man had not returned to ask for a room back. He had returned to take the whole house down with him. Garrett closed the remaining distance between us and stepped directly into my space. His right hand came out and locked around my upper arm, fingers digging hard into the wet wool of my overcoat. His purpose was clear enough. He meant to spin me around, establish physical control, and march me back out through those front doors before I could say a word to the audience watching us. As his grip tightened, something cracked open in my memory without warning, and the force of it nearly stopped me cold. I was back in our first house, a modest place, long before the freight empire or the money existed. Garrett was 5 years old and terrified during a bad summer thunderstorm. I remembered sitting on the edge of his small bed, holding that same hand while he shook. I wrapped my big calloused fingers around his tiny trembling ones and told him I would always stand between him and whatever was frightening him. I spent my whole working life honoring that promise. I tore myself down and built that estate so he would never have to know fear or want. And now, 30 years on that same hand was clamped around my arm with malicious purpose, smooth and unmarked by any honest labor, yet reaching out to shove me into the cold so he could settle gambling debts with the proceeds of my life's work. That physical contact killed the last of whatever mercy a father might hold in reserve. The man who had wanted to protect his son from monsters was gone the instant those court papers were filed. What remained was the owner of the estate. I did not move an inch. I am 72 years old, but my frame was built on decades of hauling heavy freight, and I know how a man holds his ground. I drove my boots into the marble, locked my shoulder, and twisted my arm sharply against his thumb. The leverage broke his hold cleanly, sending him lurching backward into the foyer. He caught himself blinking at me with genuine surprise. He had been so committed to the story of a frail, failing old man that he had started to believe it himself. His mouth opened another lie, ready maybe a call for security, but I was already moving. I stepped deliberately to one side and gave the floor to my attorney. Harlan Voss emerged from the shadow of the deep front portico and moved forward. He passed Garrett without so much as a glance. My son might as well have been a piece of furniture someone had left in the way. Harlan carried the quiet, predatory assurance of a seasoned litigator, walking into a courtroom he had already won. He aimed himself directly at the large marble kitchen island that divided the grand foyer from the formal dining room. The investors stepped aside to let him through, watching in bewildered, uneasy silence. He set his heavy leather briefcase down on the surface, snapped the brass locks open with two sharp metallic clicks, and reached inside. Out came the thick, precisely organized stack of airtight legal documents we had spent the previous 12 grueling hours assembling the medical certificate confirming my full mental competence, the irrevocable trust amendment cutting my son out of the fortune entirely, and the original watermarked deed to the mansion. Harlan lifted the entire stack above the counter and released it. The impact of that heavy sheaf of paper against solid marble cracked through the silent house like a gunshot, the vibration traveling up through the crystal glasses in the hands of the frozen guests. It shattered whatever remained of the open house's polished, comfortable illusion. It was the sound of the trap snapping shut, my son sealed inside the mess of his own, making the stage set for everything that came next. That single percussive slam commanded the complete attention of every person in the room. Nobody reached for a drink. Nobody murmured to their neighbor. Every investor, every developer, every socialite who had wandered in off the cobblestone driveway stood absolutely fixed, staring at the stack of documents resting on the counter. Harlan gave no one time to regroup or manufacture a fresh excuse. He straightened, adjusted his suit jacket with a slow and deliberate pull that radiated total control, then turned away from my trembling son and addressed the room. His voice was not raised. It didn't need to be. It was low and resonant, the kind of tone that rolls across high ceilings and imported rugs and finds every corner of a room without any effort. He introduced himself as the senior managing partner of his firm and the official legal counsel for the estate. He informed the assembled buyers that it was his duty to halt these proceedings immediately before every person present became a participant in a massive federal fraud. The word fraud settled over the room, the way smoke settles slowly, visibly impossible to ignore. I watched the investors recalibrate in real time. These were not soft people. They had not accumulated serious money by being careless with it. The polite, curious energy they had carried through the afternoon flipped over into something sharper and considerably less friendly. Harlan pressed his palm flat to the top of the document stack. He stated clearly and without qualification that his client Conrad Merritt was the sole and exclusive legal owner of the property before them. He explained that the deed was held within the Cecilia Merritt Trust with me as the only living trustee carrying the authority to authorize any sale. He looked directly at the developer who had been reviewing closing figures with my son minutes earlier. Garrett Merritt, Harlan said, held absolutely no equity in this estate, no power of attorney, no legal guardianship, no right of survivorship of any kind that would entitle him to list, market, or sell them home. My son's mouth opened in instinct, a reflex grasping for some argument that might pull even one plank from the wreckage. He stammered through the beginning of something, but Harlan cut straight through it with the clean efficiency of a blade. He told the room that Garrett, in the precise legal sense, was nothing more than a non-paying tenant who had dramatically overstayed his welcome. I turned my attention away from my son and found Sienna at the base of the grand staircase. What was happening to her face was something I had never seen before, a complete and total dissolution. Every trace of the polished, controlled composure she had maintained through the afternoon simply fell away. The silver tray of champagne flutes in her hands began to shake so badly that the crystal clinked together in a frantic, anxious rhythm. She stared at the documents on the marble island, then slowly shifted her gaze to her husband. And in that moment, for what I suspect was the first time in their marriage, she was seeing the actual man she had chosen. Not the billionaire heir he had been impersonating. I knew precisely what was tearing through her mind. She had organized her entire adult life around appearances around securing her position among the right people in the right rooms. She had chosen Garrett because he occupied a sprawling mansion and wore the face of limitless inherited wealth. She had endured his temper and his arrogance on the assumption that the estate and everything attached to it would one day pass naturally into their hands. Now, standing in the foyer with the documents in plain sight on the counter, the full architecture of that assumption caved in on her. The inheritance, the estate, the guaranteed flow of money. Every pillar of it was fiction. She had bound herself to a man buried under illegal gambling debts who possessed nothing of his own. He was a squatter, living off the goodwill of the very man she had pushed out into the cold and the rain the night before. The understanding that she was financially ruined and publicly exposed hit her like something physical. The investors did not linger. Wealthy people guard their capital and their reputations with equal ferocity, and they have no patience for being led into fraudulent transactions. The warmth and theater of the private open house evaporated on the spot. The developer with the leather portfolio snapped it shut with a sharp, irritated motion, and fixed my son with a look of unvarnished contempt. He informed Garrett that he had squandered his afternoon and that his legal team would be examining the fraudulent representation of the property at length. The others followed one by one. Half-empty champagne flutes were set down on whatever surface was nearest. Marble counters, antique side tables, the lid of the grand piano. The celebration simply abandoned where it stood. A brisk, purposeful movement toward the heavy oak doors took hold of the room. Coats were pulled from the hall closet. Voices muttered about audacity and misrepresentation. Not a single one of them offered my son so much as a parting glance of sympathy. They moved past him as though proximity itself carried a risk several openly threatening lawsuits for fraudulent misrepresentation as they went. Garrett stood completely motionless in the center of the grand living room and watched it happen. He watched the wealthy audience he had spent his whole life trying to impress stream out of the house in a current of righteous cold anger. He reached a hand out weakly, as though he might physically stop the tide, but closed his fingers on nothing but empty air. The sound of luxury engines turning over and pulling fast down the long driveway drifted back through the open front doors, the noise of his social standing dying in real time. Within 3 minutes, the house was emptied of strangers. The silence that poured back in was dense and suffocating. It was only Harlan, my son, my daughter-in-law, and me standing together in the rubble of what they had tried to build. I watched Sienna set the silver tray of champagne flutes carefully down on a side table. She did not look at me. She did not look at Harlan. She turned and faced her husband directly. The panic and shock that had gripped her moments earlier had set into something far colder and far more dangerous. Her eyes were flat and filled with a concentrated fury. The partnership forged entirely on greed had fractured, and what was coming between them next was not going to be quiet. The last sound of the departing cars dissolved into nothing. The grand foyer stood perfectly still. The buyers were gone. The elaborate fiction had collapsed. Sienna remained fixed near the staircase, the tray set aside, her hands still unsteady. She had turned the full weight of herself toward Garrett, not with anything resembling love, but with the cold, exacting anger of a woman who has just understood that the life she constructed rests on a foundation of worthless lies. Garrett stood on the imported Persian rug at the center of the room. He could not move. His tailored suit had somehow come to look too large for him, as if the sheer mass of his failure had physically diminished the man wearing it. He met my eyes, chest rising and falling hard, struggling to make sense of the complete demolition of everything he had manufactured. Harlan Voss did not allow him the luxury of time to recover. Harlan was a master of legal warfare, and he knew precisely where to land the killing blow. He reached into his leather briefcase one final time and drew out a single sheet of heavy legal paper. He did not slam it on the marble island. He crossed the room and stood directly in front of Garrett. He held the document out, forcing my son to confront the official county seal stamped across the top. Garrett's eyes locked onto it wide, terrified. He would not take it. His hands stayed pressed to his sides as though making contact with the paper would collapse whatever remained of his denial. Harlan simply opened his fingers and let go. The sheet drifted down and settled face up on the marble floor at my son's feet. When Harlan spoke, his voice was unhurried and absolutely deadly. "This is a 48-hour eviction notice," he said. "The locks change on Monday. Those words landed on Garrett the way a physical blow lands. His knees gave, not a stumble, not a stagger, a full collapse. He went straight down onto the cold marble landing heavily on both knees right next to the eviction notice. The arrogant property magnate, the man who had engineered all of this, was simply gone. The same man who had put me out into the freezing rain at 1 in the morning ceased to exist in that instant. What replaced him was something far smaller and far more pitiful. He looked up at me from the floor, eyes glassy and flooding. "Dad, please," Garrett begged, his voice fracturing into a high, desperate whine. "You can't do this to me. You can't throw me out. I have nowhere to go. I owe people money. They'll kill me if I don't pay them. Please, Dad, I'm your son. I'll do whatever you want. I'll go to rehab for the gambling. I'll get a job. Just please don't take the house." I stood in my damp winter coat and looked down at my only child on his knees in the middle of my foyer. I went looking inside myself for some trace of mercy. I searched for the enormous love that had originally driven me to build everything I had built. I expected the sight of him broken like this to tear something open in me, that deep aching pain a father feels watching his son come apart completely. But looking at his tear-streaked face, I felt nothing. The empathy was gone, burned away to nothing. Over the past 10 years, Garrett had waged a quiet, methodical campaign of psychological abuse against me. He had taken the grief I carried over his mother's death and turned it into a lever, using my guilt to extract every last ounce of money and energy I had. He had treated me as a nuisance to be managed, a human bank account, to be emptied and set aside once it had been drained of its usefulness. He was not weeping now out of any remorse for what he had put me through. He was weeping because he had finally exhausted every other person's resources available to him. Before I could say anything at all, Sienna detonated. The shock had burned off, and something rawer had taken its place. She did not go to her husband. She did not kneel beside him. She came across the foyer in sharp, deliberate strides, her expensive heels striking the stone with a hard, rhythmic crack. She positioned herself directly over Garrett and unleashed a fury that shook the high ceilings. "You lied to me!" she screamed, her voice breaking and reverberating through the vaulted space of the mansion. She reached down and struck him hard on the chest with both of her fists. "You have absolutely nothing. You are completely broke. You told me you owned this estate. You told me your father was leaving you millions of dollars. You are nothing but a pathetic squatter." Garrett grabbed for her hands, pleading with her to settle down, begging her to stay and work through it together. Sienna tore her hands away with a violent jerk. She fixed him with a look of absolute, undiluted disgust. Then she turned her back on him and ran up the sweeping grand staircase, heading for the master suite to pack her designer bags and be gone from his life for good. Garrett was still on his knees on the marble floor, sobbing without restraint, calling up the stairs for Sienna to come back, begging me to destroy the eviction notice. He was a man entirely crushed under the weight of his own staggering greed. I looked at the spectacle playing out in the foyer of my beautiful home, and I did not say a word. No final speech, no demand for an apology, no parting declaration of any kind. The silence I offered him was its own verdict. I turned my back on my son and walked out through the heavy oak front doors with Harlan at my side. I went down the stone steps and drew a long breath of cold winter air. And what I felt was a liberation so clean and complete, it was almost difficult to hold. I left the mansion behind in a state of utter consuming chaos. Their greed had turned on itself and was finishing the job. Exactly 1 week had passed since the heavy oak doors of the suburban estate closed behind me for the last time. I stood in the center of the grand foyer on that final morning. The imported marble floors had been stripped bare. The extravagant furniture, the Persian rugs, the curated artwork, all of it, cleared out by a professional estate liquidation company. The massive crystal chandelier, the one I had flown secretly to Italy to buy for Cecilia, still hung from the soaring dome above, but every trace of life had been drained from the room. It was no longer a home. It was a large hollow shell of brick and glass. My son and his wife were gone out within exactly 48 hours of Harlan handing them the eviction notice, retreating into the ruin of their own reputation, left to find a way forward without my accounts to prop up their illusions. Harlan Voss stood beside me with his familiar leather briefcase. We had not come to look back at anything. We were there to complete the final transfer of power. Harlan laid out a thick stack of legal documents on a small folding table the liquidators had left in the empty room. These were not eviction notices or trust amendments. These were the official endowment papers. I picked up a plain black pen and worked my way through each page, signing my name at the bottom. With every stroke, I officially conveyed ownership of the sprawling, multi-million-dollar property to the Regional Veterans Housing Foundation, fulfilling at last the dying wish of my late wife. Cecilia never truly wanted this vast suburban fortress. In the early days of my logistics company, when the money first began flowing in, I had purchased the estate as a grand romantic gesture. I believed it was the ultimate prize for everything we had endured together. I thought that sheer scale of it, the size and the prestige, would somehow shield us from the hardships of the world. But Cecilia was a woman of simple, deep convictions. She would tell me often that the towering brick walls and the acres of manicured lawn felt like a beautiful gilded cage. She stayed in this house because she believed the neighborhood and the elite school district would give Garrett the grounding he needed to grow into an honorable man. We had long outgrown this kind of life. Cecilia always loved the ocean. She used to say that what she truly wanted was to grow old in a small, quiet house where she could fall asleep with the sound of the tide coming through the window. I had held on to this massive estate long after she died, preserving it purely to maintain some semblance of a family for my son. Signing it over to the charity was not a loss. It was not a tragedy. It was the deepest liberation my soul had ever known. Harlan gathered the signed pages and returned them carefully to his briefcase. He put out his hand, and I took it and held it firmly. The hand of the man who had engineered my legal salvation. He assured me he would manage the remaining transition with the charity board personally, and that my son's creditors would never be able to reach a single dollar of the endowment. I walked out through the heavy front doors and locked them for the last time. I did not look back at the columns or the long driveway. I got in my car and pulled away from the affluent suburbs, the socialites, the developers, and the whole poison legacy of unearned wealth receding in the mirror behind me. I drove south toward a place I should have pointed myself toward 10 years ago. The long drive down the eastern seaboard gave me space to let the quiet of my new life settle in around me. I watched city skylines dissolve into open highway and walls of pine. I reached the coast of South Carolina just as the evening tide was moving in, and there at the edge of the water sat the small weathered cabin I had bought months earlier, but never had the freedom to move into, not while Garrett was still drawing the air out of everything around him. Now the cabin was the whole of my world. It was a modest wooden place, faded gray shingles, a wide wraparound porch that looked out over the full open sweep of the Atlantic. No imported marble underfoot, no crystal catching the light overhead. Just the solid, unpretentious workmanship of a structure built to hold its ground against serious coastal weather. I was up the next morning, well before the sun had any intention of clearing the horizon. Not because a phone was shaking itself across a nightstand. Not because a daughter-in-law was firing off demands from down the hall. Not because the suffocating pressure of a family bent on dismantling my sanity had jolted me awake. I opened my eyes to the ocean, its steady rhythmic push and pull against the shoreline even, and unhurried. The air in the cabin was cool and carried that sharp, clean bite of salt and old driftwood. I went into the small kitchen and put on a simple pot of dark coffee. No private caterer, no elaborate spread required. I filled a heavy enamel mug with the steaming black coffee and carried it out onto the wooden deck. The coastal wind got up under the collar of my wool jacket and nipped at my neck, but it felt exactly right, clarifying rather than harsh. I settled against the railing and watched the sky work through its transitions, dark fading into deep purple and then into a wash of orange and gold. The sun hauled itself up over the dark water and threw a long, brilliant path of light straight across the surface of the rolling sea. I brought the mug up and took a slow, deliberate swallow, letting the bitter heat move down through my chest. My phone lay on the small wooden table beside me, screen black and still. No alerts pushing through from bank managers, no frantic messages from my son, no desperate appeals for another bailout. The loud, relentless, consuming world I had endured for a full decade had gone completely quiet. Cutting my only child out of my life was the most painful thing I had done across 72 years, on this earth, the hardest, most agonizing undertaking I had ever forced myself through. It demanded that I deliberately break my own heart in order to rescue my own soul. But out here on this deck, pulling in the cold salt air, I understood that the crushing manufactured guilt I had carried for so long had finally been set down. I had arrived at something I should have understood far sooner. You cannot purchase character, and you cannot keep love alive by subsidizing it. Real respect grows from honesty and the willingness to hold a line, not from endless financial surrender. I watched the seabirds fold their wings and drop toward the churning waves, and something deep and steady settled over me, a quiet, unshakable peace. If you've stayed with me all the way to the end of this one, I want to say thank you. Genuinely, this story cost something to tell. Looking back on what Conrad went through, losing the home he built, losing the son, he sacrificed everything for having to choose between his own survival and the love he never stopped offering. I believe God doesn't let a man reach that kind of breaking point without a purpose behind it. Sometimes the life you were meant to live only opens up after the one you were clinging to finally falls away. That is painful, but it is also mercy. If these grandpa revenge stories have taught me anything, it's this. First, never let guilt become someone else's leverage. The moment love becomes a transaction, it is no longer love, it is control. Protect yourself accordingly. Second, document everything before you act. Quiet preparation is more powerful than a loud confrontation. Third, if you want to truly honor the people you've lost, live the life they actually wanted for you, not the monument you built in their name. Fourth, real father stories don't always end with reconciliation. Sometimes the most loving thing a parent can do is stop enabling and start living. If this story moved, you share it with someone who needs to hear it today. A friend carrying too much guilt, a family member who keeps giving to people who only take. And if you haven't already subscribed to Grandpa's Revenge so you never miss a story like this one, leave me a comment below telling me what part of Conrad's journey stayed with you the most. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next one.